busy just trying to somehow keep the doors open. It doesn't need to happen. Hi.
Just a question on this. I fully agree with you, and I think the capital needed for efficiency is how can we make that case to funders? How can we make that case to our board and say we need to make the investment up front, otherwise it's going to cost more in the long run?
Everybody get the question? Okay. Next slide. The Bridgespan Group did a study which was published in Stanford Social Innovation Review, which is a great magazine. Does everybody get that one? SSIR? Stanford Social Innovation Review, ssireview.org. There's the URL is down at the bottom. This is a direct quote from this article. Okay? The researchers state that our research reveals that a vicious cycle fuels the persistent underfunding of overhead. The first step in the cycle is funders' unrealistic expectations about how much it costs to run a nonprofit. We've already covered that, remember? At the second step, the nonprofits feel pressure to conform to funders' unrealistic expectations. Okay? So this is where you guys come in. At the third step, nonprofits respond to this pressure in two very predictable ways. They spend too little on overhead, and the authors are very, very diplomatic here, and they underreport their expenditures on tax forms and fundraising material. Okay? How many of you have CPAs or accountants who prepare your 990 who said you don't need to put anything in fundraising? Well, thank goodness, because that used to be pretty common when I'd ask that question. Okay? But there's this huge pressure, external pressure on us to not spend any money, and we get stuck in this cycle. Okay. And that's what's called the nonprofit starvation cycle. Larry.
So, and it's true in the corporate world, and this is one of the reasons that we have trouble with funders. This whole concept of direct and indirect costs.
Yeah, and Larry's pointing out that this whole concept of direct and indirect costs it's very, very, very true in the corporate world as well. So this is not just, a not-for-profit kind of a thing, except for just realize that you've got Charity Navigator and GuideStar and people out there who are calculating these ratios and publishing for everybody. And we're going to get to that as well. Okay. So, again, this is a very long article, and I definitely advise that you read it. And it's available online as a free download. So you can certainly go home and go look at it. And they basically place the burden of breaking this cycle at the door of the funders, okay? And they really, really think that there should be an industry-wide sort of effort around this. But then they make this very prescient point, which is that the burden does not rest solely with the funders, okay? There are two players in this game, and we're buying in. So nonprofit leaders play a role. And they're recommending that as a baseline task, we commit to understanding our real overhead costs and our real infrastructure needs, okay? As a first step, let's at least understand them, okay? And that's where people like me come in. We count things, right? Okay. But there's got to be something else we can do. So what's that? Number one. It's a business. You're in the business of providing social services. You're not in the business of making a profit for shareholders, but it's still a business, right? Mm-hmm. You need to be efficient. You need to be effective. Don't waste time doing things that you don't need to do. But on the same flip side of that same coin, make sure you're doing the things that you do need to do. Okay? This is a good one. Measure and reward performance. In the corporate world, we talk about this all the time, and we have, incentive comp plans and all kinds of things where we can incentivize our people or reward them at the end of the year. It's very difficult to do that in the not-for-profit space for a couple of reasons. One, of course, is that cash is a problem, but the second is that people are looking, okay? And that, obviously you're not going to compensate your development people for, you're not going to commission them for bringing in money, okay? There's a conflict of interest there. There's all kinds, whereas I can pay my salespeople as much as I want in commissions for bringing in business to my firm. So there's a few differences, but there are things you can do, but it starts with measuring. So, your staff ought to have performance plans, just like they would if they were in the for-profit world. You ought to know what you consider as an organization good performance, whether it be in your secretary or your executive director or your director of development or the person who's doing your marketing and advertising, whatever. Everybody should have, I have an operational goal for myself every year. All my people do too, and there's no reason why you can't do that in the not-for-profit space, so that everybody is working on a plan. Just like your development plan that Ray was talking about. If you don't have a plan, you're not going to get there. Individually, we need that too. And then the board and the director can come up with ways to reward that performance that possibly don't involve monetary compensation. It might involve a couple of extra vacation days. It might involve some continuing education that the organization can pay for that would benefit the organization and the individual. It might involve a good parking space, There's a lot, or employee of the month. There's lots and lots and lots of ways to incentivize people to perform, but it has to start with, what are you measuring, okay? This is a great way to get more effective and more efficient. You would be absolutely shocked at how well it works. Making sure our systems communicate with each other. We talked about that. Let's not key punch it twice when we can key punch it once, okay? Investing in technology and infrastructure, and again, taking that long-term view. Okay? We want to remember that on the financial statements, if we're investing in things like computers and softwares and things like that, that doesn't hit our statement of activities. We're going to talk about that in a minute. That actually is a balance sheet item. So if we're worried about that overhead percentage, sometimes people can say, oh, maybe it's not such an issue. It's a matter of finding the money for it, but it's not going to negatively impact how people view our profit and loss statement. Okay, so that's something to just keep in the back of your mind. Hire the right people for the right jobs. And Ray made that point very well when he said, you know what, the gal who's doing the phones and she's great and she's taking the appointments and everything else, don't make her responsible for the donor database. She can't do it. Her day's too bifurcated. It's a specialty. You need to understand what kind of information you want in there. Maybe she can move up into that position, but you really need to be thinking about the right people for the right tasks. Okay? I don't change tires. I'm really bad at it. And training for boards and training for staff. So this is the recap of this section of my presentation. We're going to maximize efficiency. We're going to analyze and report thoroughly, honestly, and in a timely manner so we can do something with the information. And we're going to try to communicate with our funders, and we're going to make the case for operating support, not just program support. And the way we do that is by starting with that idea that we first of all need to know for ourselves what those numbers are. Okay? So as I said, everybody's situation in this room is going to be just different enough that we can't get into a lot more detail. I can take a couple of questions before, because I still have some time before I move on to the rest of the presentation. Yes?
I think the piece that continuously puzzles me about funders not funding these operating expenses is many of them have the same expenses.
That's a very good point. She said the thing that's puzzling is that many of the funders have the same expenses, but yet they really don't want to fund them.
Those are the tax-deductible expenses, by the way.
And yeah, so you get the whole tax thing going on. There's a lot of complexity in this area that we just don't have time to dig into a whole lot today. This is really an overview more than anything
I
else.
think that the sophisticated funders think that your donors are going to do it, your community is going to support it.
Yeah, and that's a good point. A lot of funders do make the assumption that you're going to go out into the community to raise your overhead money and that they really only have to fund your program. That to me is a really upside down kind of a view. And I think that my personal opinion is that we need to do a much better job of educating the funding community to really look at it as what's it going to cost to develop this program and what's it going to cost to deliver this program. Part of the cost of delivering the program is the infrastructure to support it. And there's just no way around that. And you really can't bifurcate those things. They go together. I had one more question and then we're going to move on. Go ahead.
My impression is that particularly in the foundation world,